Making a Magic Harp. Written and read by Kyra Eliason. Chapter 1. The afternoon sun streamed through the window into her little attic room, warming it pleasantly and making the whole room feel bright and airy. It was a small room, but she'd made it hers, breaking up the wooden board of the floors and walls with cream and pink, curtains and bedspread acquired over years of small wages and meticulous hand-sewing. Elora tucked her wings in close, not wanting to ruin the magic she was working with a stray feather or breeze. She'd been working on this for too long to ruin it now. Not now when it was so close. Just 5 more strings. She took the braid, carefully woven of 7 strands of long golden hair, just exactly as long as she needed. The hair had been a gift. She'd asked for it, but that made it no less a gift, as no payment had been asked in return. She tied one end very carefully at the top of the harp, pulling it taut, but not too tight, and fastened the other end. Very gently she plucked each string she had so far, soft, sweet tones filling her little space. She listened carefully, tuning the new one to the right note. "Elora!" a familiar voice called, and she quickly threw her blanket over the unfinished harp, dusting her hands off on her apron as if there were evidence on them that might show what she'd been doing. She ran out of the room, shutting the door very quietly and turning to the side, so it would look more like she'd been passing by, not that she'd been inside. "Coming!" Elora called, trying to hit that tone between eager to please and calm, without guilt over having been away from her place. "Oh, good. I've been looking for you for ages. You're needed in the library," the matron of the first-year class said, a bit sternly, as Elora reached her. Elora hid her worry. "Yes, ma'am. I'll go there right away." If it was first years, they'd probably gone and made a mess of all the books. Again. It seemed no one properly respected the library until they'd been studying at least a full year. But since the school accepted new students yearly, Elora had to deal with an assortment of people that believed "student" meant they didn't have to clean up behind themselves. Well, it was at least possible she could get another gift for finishing the harp. She'd have used her own hair, but it was too short, a pale, tan-colored fluff more like down than hair anymore, and wasn't good for any but the first few smallest strings, even after braiding. And anyway, the magic she was trying to imbue the harp with always seemed to work best with a variety of gifts. She ran down into the library, her wings fanning out for balance and tucking in so she could get through the door. She didn't expect someone to be standing directly in front of the door, and her wings shot out instinctively to break, one of them smacking into the door, making it bang against the wall very loudly. She winced as every eye in the room was drawn to her abrupt entrance. She really shouldn't have tried to run in. The man she'd nearly crashed into was a wizard, old, with long robes and thick glasses. He was a frequent visitor of the library, sometimes staying for hours at a time. His eyes were wide, blinking at her with a hand on his chest. She tucked in her wings quickly, with a very small, "Sorry." "She's cursed," one of the first years murmured. Elora fluffed up in indignation, looking around the wizard to try and see who had said it. "It's a blessing!" The man set a hand on her head, which, on top of everything else, seemed incredibly condescending. "It's all right, dear. They're young and foolish." "Yes," she bit out, "they are." She walked off into the shelves of books, leaving them all behind. Of course, there was a wave of whispers as she left their line of sight, but she genuinely didn't want to hear them. Her cheeks burned with both embarrassment and anger, and she avoided the eyes of anyone she could see, just picking up books and scrolls that were out of place and collecting them onto the cart, ready for putting away later when there were less rude people milling around the library. They left her alone for a while, which she appreciated, still upset that they whispered and judged her, but glad that they at least had enough sense not to bother her directly. She carried another armful of books back to the cart, and there was a boy standing beside it, watching her silently. She ignored him, stubbornly keeping her gaze averted for several trips back and forth, but finally the cart was full, and she frowned rather grumpily at him. "What?" He looked down and shuffled awkwardly. He was young, younger than most first years that were accepted, with curly black hair and dark skin that contrasted with the light gray of the first-year robes. "Sorry, it can wait if you're busy." Elora sighed and made an effort to relax her frown. "No, go ahead. What is it?" He lifted the book in his arms. This references the Chronicles of Ephior, and I wanted to try and find them. Elora thought for a moment. Ah, I remember. That one always used to catch me, too. Ephior went and called what is more technically a diary his Chronicles. Since they don't record any historical events, only his own experiments and homemade spells and various musings, they aren't categorized by the library with the other chronicles. Look in the personal writings shelves. It'll be under C or I. The boy nodded, his expression empty other than a politeness he seemed to exude. Thank you. Are you a student here too, then? Elora blinked and nearly blushed. Oh, no, I'm not. But since I work in the library, I'm allowed to read the books, and the Chronicles of Ephior are pretty well known. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. For all your teachers will tell you he was eccentric and dangerously experimental, he's influenced many great users of magic. The boy nodded again, slowly, his dark eyes wide. Not able to resist, Elora lowered her tone further, leaning in a bit more. Often, experimenting on your own will get you better results than the kinds of spells they teach you in class. But you didn't hear that from me. He nodded a third time, his face solemn, but a spark of curiosity plain in his eyes. Elora stood straight again and grinned. Well, off you go. If you can't find it after a while, come back and I'll help you. He scurried off, headed right for the correct section. Elora went back to her book collecting, feeling much better than she had previously. Eventually, the first-year class moved on to their next class, and she was able to replace the books to their proper places in peace. The other staff of the library didn't badger her to keep her wings tucked up out of the way, like visitors sometimes did, and it was nice to be able to let them rest or flare out as was comfortable when there were only a few roaming people in the library. She slid the last scroll into its round slot and smiled. Unless there was a stack of returned books waiting at the front desk, she should be done. She hadn't gotten any hair, though, which was a shame. Perhaps she could see if there was anyone else she could ask. Most of the teachers or professors didn't care for her, certainly not enough to gift her anything. The cursed reputation always ran ahead of her. They acted like she was a charity case, as if letting her work here was in itself a tremendous favor, and especially they considered her wages to be of the utmost generosity on the behalf of the school, which absolved them of any at all guilt about refusing her requests. But perhaps another of the staff. They liked her a bit better. Surely there was someone she hadn't yet asked. She went outside, wandering a bit in the gathering dusk. Perhaps the groundskeeper would have hired another helper. He never could seem to keep enough workers. A few explosions and tramplings of a carefully tended flower bed from inexperienced magic users was enough to make many quit. She knocked on the greenhouse door, knowing that the groundskeeper tended to visit here just before dinner time to make sure no one was hiding inside before he locked it up for the night. "You'll want to be careful with this one," she heard him saying to someone. "When transplanted, it tries to root immediately, and if you aren't using something it can't root through, like a metal pail, you'll end up with a stuck plant rather than an uprooted one." He chuckled lightly. "And no one wants to be the one stuck with a woven basket now firmly filled with Esettle." Elora turned the corner to see the groundskeeper, Mr. Ritter, and a woman close to her own age. They were both smiling and chatting amiably. Despite herself, Elora couldn't help but notice the waist-length, shiny black hair. But quickly she turned her attention away from that. It wasn't fair to anyone to be seen only for what someone wanted from them. The woman was short and fat, with dark brown skin and beautifully dark eyes. She wasn't wearing a student uniform, but Elora didn't want to assume too much. She had a bright smile and an even brighter feel to her whole person. And then she looked past the groundskeeper at Elora, who couldn't help a moment of "pretty person noticing me" panic before she managed a small smile and wave. "Ah, Elora, nice to see you," Mr. Ritter said, his voice warm and gravelly. "This is Asha. She's here as how did you say it? Similar to an apprentice?" Asha smiled pleasantly. "I'm here to study plants, especially magical plants. I get to learn and stay here in exchange for helping out on the grounds." Elora brightened. "Oh, that's similar to what I do. I'm working in the library." The groundskeeper gave a short nod, clearly pleased with himself. "I figured the two of you would get along. Why don't you join us for dinner, Elora? We can be done with instruction for tonight." Elora nodded. "I'd love to join you." The groundskeeper led the way out, locking the door behind them, and Asha came to walk beside Elora. "So how's the library? I haven't seen it yet, but I imagine in an academy like this it must be impressive," Asha said, and even her voice was pretty, smooth and low with a slight accent. "Oh, it is," Elora said excitedly. "It's not as large as you might think, but it has so many books and scrolls on magic and magical items and spells, and really almost everything in the library that isn't a book or a shelf actually is a magical item." "Oh, that sounds amazing! What kinds of magical items?" Asha's eyes were bright, and she looked so genuinely interested that Elora felt both at ease and excited. "Well, there's a massive globe, and if you have enough knowledge of a place, it'll turn itself to point out that place for you. It's said that ancient lost civilizations were found by using it." "Wow," Asha said. "That must be incredibly helpful." Encouraged by this, Elora went on. "There's a set of quills made from magical feathers that you can use to write as quickly as you can think, though you certainly have to be careful not to let your thoughts wander. And there's a certain shelf that has all the round slots for scrolls, but the scrolls are empty, and if you take one when the shelf is mostly full, it'll somehow make a new one by itself. And it might be a little mundane, but there's a stepladder that moves itself, so if you have to get a shelf or two over, you can without climbing all the way down and back up again. It's very useful when putting away lots of books." Elora suddenly realized she was rambling and quickly closed her mouth. "Those sound brilliant," Asha said, "and very useful in a library. Did you give some of your feathers for the quells?" Oh no, my feathers wouldn't do anything nearly as impressive as that. They're quite mundane," Elora said, suddenly a bit disappointed in her own feathers for not being any more noteworthy. Asha nodded, still somehow looking interested. "How did you get to have feathers? Were you born with them?" And that was a bit of a touchy subject for Elora. "Well, it was I think it was a failed spell, though I'm not certain. But it's become a blessing to me. I love my wings, and my hair, and I wouldn't part with them even if I knew how." Asha smiled. "They're certainly beautiful, and I apologize if I pried too much." They'd reached the groundskeeper's house, somehow having walked all that way during the short, or at least to Elora it seemed short, talk. She tucked her wings in close to get through the door. "Oh, it's all right," she said, any lingering discomfort soothed by the compliment. "It's a rather obvious question." "Oh, lovely. Dinner's been made already," the groundskeeper said jovially, crossing the room to his wife and kissing her. "Thank you, dear. We have another guest I didn't mention. Will there be enough, or should I bring in some fruit?" "Oh, there's plenty for Elora, too," Mrs. Ritter said, smiling across at Elora. "It's always nice to have you for dinner." "Thank you, Mrs. Ritter," Elora said with a smile. She liked Mrs. Ritter. Her home was always open to Elora, a calm and cozy place away from the bustle and problems of the students. Mrs. Ritter had made a large, layered salad, filled with fruits and berries and chicken, and probably at least 4 different kinds of greens. Elora really didn't know that much about plants, and just listened, very intrigued, as Asha and Mrs. Ritter discussed what all went into the salad, where it was from, and why it had been added. At the very end of it, Elora felt a bit bewildered, but thoroughly convinced that the salad was as good for her as it was tasty. "So, Elora, how's your secret project been coming?" Mrs. Ritter asked, doling out something delicious-smelling that looked like a cobbler. Asha also looked to Elora, who was reminded that she would very much like a few strands of Asha's hair to continue working with, and also wasn't sure, even with this convenient mention of it, how to ask. "Yes, I'd love to know," Mr. Ritter said. "Oh, it's going well. I'm very close to done. Just a few more steps," Elora said, a touch dismissively, thinking the topic would end there. "What is it?" Asha asked. "Oh, but if it's a secret, sorry. Good luck, though." Elora chuckled a bit awkwardly. It is a secret, but only until it's done. Once I'm finished, if it works, I'd be happy to show you." Here she was, barely having met Asha, and already willing to show her the harp that would surely get her in trouble if news about it went around. But then Asha smiled, dispelling Elora's worries. "I'd love to see it. Is it magical?" Elora nodded immediately. "Yes, it is, and actually—" Awkwardness set in abruptly and uncomfortably. Well, you can obviously say no, but, it uses hair to make." Would it have an effect on me if you used some of mine? Asha asked, thankfully cutting off the rest of Ellara's stumbling request. She wasn't sure why it was so much more difficult to ask Asha. Perhaps because she'd only newly met her? But other students at the school she'd never spoken to before were easy. Just a quick, "I'm making a magical item. Could I have a bit of your hair?" It was probably that Asha was pretty. And nice. She always felt awkward around pretty people. "Oh, no, it wouldn't affect you, or it's not supposed to, at least. Other than you not having the hair anymore, I mean." Ellara's face was getting warm. "I don't mind, then." Asha smiled, all bright and sweet, and Ellara couldn't have resisted smiling back even if she'd been trying. Her embarrassment melted. "Does it matter if it's cut?" Asha asked, pulling a small pair of green-stained scissors out of a pouch on her hip. Ellara shook her head. "No, it just matters that it's freely given." Asha pulled a lock of hair from the back of her head and snipped it close to the scalp, winding it into a small skein and holding it out to Ellara. "Here you go. Freely given. Though I really would like to see what it helps make." Ellara nodded immediately. "Yes, of course I'll show you. Thank you." "No problem. I have plenty." Ellara probably hadn't stopped smiling since before dinner, but she smiled a bit wider, and then realized she should probably head back to her own room. She didn't want to be rude to the Ritters, and they'd already let her eat dinner with them unexpectedly. "Well, I won't impose for any longer. Thank you so much for inviting me to dinner." "You're very welcome," Mrs. Ritter said kindly. "Feel free to come over any time. We don't get visitors very often." The groundskeeper nodded, getting up from his chair. "I could walk out with you to the main building." "Oh, thank you, but I'll be fine," Ellara said. "And it was really nice to meet you, Asha." "It was nice to meet you, too. I hope we run into each other again soon." Ellara smiled and nodded, and then got up. Mr. Ritter opened the door for her and watched after her as she walked away. It was several minutes of walking back to the main building, and it was rather dark by now, but the moonlight was enough to see by, and the stars were beautiful. She felt light and full, like she could do a spin just for the joy of existing on such a pretty night as this. She didn't actually spin, but walked back slowly and meanderingly, looking up at the stars rather than paying attention to her steps. When she finally got back to her room, she had to consider carefully. Light one of her last 3 candles, and work on the harp by candlelight, or wait and try to sneak away again in the afternoon tomorrow to do it then. Though she did get paid in 5 days. She'd be able to afford a few more candles if she waited until the next payday to get a new apron. She could probably try again to sew up the big pocket, which was dangling open now. She needed it since it was invaluable for carrying books when she wasn't able to use her hands, or for scrolls. But her sewing skills weren't exactly the strongest, despite all her attempts and practice, and the other times she'd sewn the pocket back up, it had only been a few days before it had ripped open under the weight of the books again. Perhaps she could ask someone else to sew it up for her? At that thought she was decided. She lit the candle and unwound the hair, measuring it against the size of the harp. It was more than long enough. She would only have to braid 3 hairs together, not worry about carefully splicing more hairs into the braid to make it reach. She lined up 3 hairs and set the candlestick on top of the ends, tying them together, and then carefully and evenly braiding them all the way down. The braid was so fine with only 3 strands that the braiding took time. Actually stringing the harp needed more than a flickering candle, so she carefully put the braid away and started on a second. She could make 4 braids and have 1 last strand of hair if she didn't break any. And with 1 strand of hair long enough, it would be so much easier to splice hair into a braid for that last strand. She could possibly even use her own. And wouldn't that be rather fitting, to have her own hair be a part of the first and last strings? She stayed up a few more hours, very carefully braiding. Her own hair may have been a fitting idea, but splicing that many times to get a long enough strand took a very long time. But finally, she had them. Everything she needed. She could finish her harp tomorrow.